Again, welcome everyone to the PAG TIP Subcommittee meeting. This is a staff-run subcommittee, and I'll be acting as chair for today's meeting. Let's call the August 6th, 2020 PAG TIP Subcommittee to order. Please note that while PAG RTA meetings are conducted virtually, we want to remind subcommittee members the meetings are open to the public. Subcommittee members are obligated to comply with Arizona's open meeting law and only discuss matters on the agenda during the public meeting. Before we move on, let's do introductions. And so I think what maybe will work best is if I could just say your name, and this is also a way we can test the audio for everybody. I'll go down the list, and if you can just say your name and organization when I call you, we'll note that for the records. So I'm going to start with the attendees in the screen. Ms. Olivares.
I'm here. Sorry, I had to log in as an attendee, not as a participant. I had issues.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you. And by the way, if people have feedback about this meeting that they wish to share after the meeting to make it better for the next time, please do feel free to reach out. Mr. Bemis.
Hello, Andy Bemis, City of Tucson, Transportation and Mobility.
Great, thank you. Ms. Abramovitz.
I'm here, Town of Sarita.
Thank you, Beth. A staff member, Mr. Alice. I see Brad Alice with PAG Communications is here. Ms. Lori.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Jamie.
Mr. Grossman.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Town of Marana, Dan Grossman.
Thank you. Mr. Bahe.
Yes, Jason Bahi, Paskayaki Tribe.
Great, thank you. Mr. Hurley. I see that John Hurley is on the line. We can't hear you, John, but we see you listed there. Mr. Rodriguez. Jose, are you with us? See you listed there. Hopefully people aren't having audio issues. And Crystal, I don't know if there's a way that we can tell if people are having trouble with the audio, but there's a chat area to please note that with us if you're having trouble with the audio. Mr. Brand.
Keith Brand, Town of Marana, present.
Thank you. Mr. Hoffman.
Good morning, Mark Hoffman with ADOT Planning.
Great, thank you. Mr. Jensen.
Hi, Mick Jensen, City of South Tucson.
Great, thank you. Ms. Pablo.
I don't see that she has audio, so we will send her that information.
Thank you. Mr. Hartley.
Morning, Patrick Hartley, City of Tucson.
Thank you. Mr. Casartano.
Good morning, Paul Casartano here with PAG.
Thank you. Ms. Rain. Okay, Ms. Rain is listed, but we're not hearing her. Let's see. Jose is Rodriguez's audio. Okay. Okay, and Mr. Lane.
Good morning, Rod Lane with the Arizona Department of Transportation, South Central District.
Thank you. We have some staff members here who may be presenting or are available for questions. Mr. Atler.
Good morning, everybody.
Thank you. Mr. McGinnis.
Good morning, James McGinnis, PAG RTA.
Great, thank you. Mr. DeGrood.
Good morning, everyone. Glad to see you all today or hear you all today. And if you are having problems with your computer audio, on the email that was sent out, there's also an opportunity for you to do a phone call that you could use if you are having difficulty with your audio.
Great, thank you, Jim. Mr. Barrett.
I'm here. Hello.
Thank you. And Crystal Spires.
Hi, good morning.
Thank you. And Sonia Kelly.
Good morning, everybody.
Great, thank you. So hopefully I captured everybody, but some folks may have come in. Did anybody come in after I went through the lists for attendance that wants to mention that they're now joining us? Okay. And Crystal, are there any, in addition to what Jim mentioned about the audio and the phone option, is there anything else we should mention if people are having audio issues?
No, Jim was absolutely right. That phone number on the email, and there's also a tech support number on there as well if they need to call for assistance.
Okay, thank you very much.
It looks like a couple of them fixed, so we're working on the others as well.
Excellent, thank you very much.
Jamie, one thing I wanted to mention is they won't be able to hear this because if this is the issue, but when you first open the meeting, you get that test your audio dialog box.
Okay.
If you don't close that, you won't be able to hear the meeting until you close that.
Okay.
I noticed so that some people could still have that open behind this window and they can't see it.
Okay, thank you. And if there's a way that you're able to, it sounds like Crystal is helping to troubleshoot some of the audio issues and may be able to notify those folks. So thank you, James. Appreciate it. Okay, I think we're ready to move on to item 2. Is there anything else just in terms of logistics we should mention? We're getting somewhat new to this technology, so we're learning and wanted to move as smoothly as possible and make sure that everybody can participate. Okay, item 2, in-kind form. The in-kind form serves both as an attendance sheet and also to report hours spent preparing, attending, and following up from these meetings. Non-federal hours can be used as match for the federal grants that PAG uses for the planning and programming we conduct. To help these dollars go as far as possible, it's important that we document in-kind. Typically, we circulate the in-kind form during the meeting, but since this is being conducted virtually, we ask that you please let me know if you're paid with federal dollars for this meeting. So if anyone is being paid with federal dollars, can you please let me know right now, just unmute and say you're being paid with federal dollars, please. Okay, and you're also welcome to enter that in the chat. Yes, was someone speaking?
Oh, I'm sorry, Jason Bahi. Yes, I am being paid by federal dollars.
Thank you, Jason. Anyone else?
Jamie, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I was having trouble at first. I finally got in.
Oh, is that Jose?
Yes, it's Jose Orvelli.
Great, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Okay, so if anyone else is being paid with federal sources that didn't get a chance to speak, please feel free to reach out after the meeting or put a note in the chat. Okay, so moving on to item 3. This is an information item on a Regional Transportation Authority revenue update. Mr. Jim DeGrood is our speaker, and I'll turn it over to Mr. DeGrood.
Okay, thank you very much, Jamie. See if I got control of the screen here. Not quite yet. Anyway, what I'm going to do today, there we go. I'm in business. Wanted to give everybody an update on where we stand with RTA revenue. As we all know, we're in tumultuous times as a result, and everybody an update on where we're at, what we're thinking in terms of this fiscal year and what was approved by the board in terms of a budget, as well as what we're looking at on a going forward basis as we begin the development of the 2022 to 2026 TIP, and certainly there are also implications on the RTA Next process. So I'll give you a brief update on where we stand. First, in terms of where we closed out the last fiscal year 20, we were doing really, really well going into the pandemic closures, and that really carried us through. We exceeded our budget substantially. Now, our budget was based upon a prior Eller estimate that was done. The Eller Economic and Business Research Center does estimates for us every 2 to 3 years. We had one that was 2 years old that we were utilizing for the current or for this past year's initial budget. At the end of the budgeting process, in fact, when we adopted the budget, we also received an updated report. So we did get a 2019 LR estimate that actually showed estimates for 2020 that were closer to what we actually collected. Even with the economic downturn, we still exceeded it. And I'll show you what this looks like here. In terms of what we collected in 2019, Tucson 2020, fiscal 20, we collected $3.1 million more than we did even with the economic downturn. The last 2 months of the year, we show them as May and June. Those were actually called transactions that occurred during the months of March and April. So we book our revenue the month that we receive our check from the Arizona Department of Revenue. So revenue is collected in, let's say, March. It is remitted to Arizona Department of Revenue in April by the collectors or the retailers, and then it is dispersed to us in the month of May. So what you're looking at when you see this 7.77% decline, that was for transactions that occurred during the month of March. The month of April, when we had the full shelter in place orders, we did see an even greater decline. But even so, we still, with those two poor performing months, we still ended up exceeding the prior year by 3.59%. And our budget, which had been set, when we set our revenue budget, typically we do it in the month of March. We had a very strong close in the month of, or in fiscal 19. So our fiscal 19 actuals exceeded our fiscal 20 budget. So that all got adjusted and with the new Eller economic update. So now for kind of the pleasing news. As we have started the new fiscal year, we did take a deposit during the month of July, our first month of the fiscal year for fiscal 21. That was for collections that occurred during the month of May. That was $7.64 million. If you look at that and compare it to the May a year prior, and it's not clicking on me, but we actually exceeded it by some $300,000. And so we are seeing an increase. This is likely due to the reopening of our economy and some pent-up demand. You can see that when we compare it in the stream here, this is a new graph that we've been presenting recently. The green bars represent the actual dollars collected. The red line represents the growth rate compared to the year prior. So we were at 4.3% over the same month in 2019 for our July deposit representing May transactions. Now, when we look at doing our budgets, we generally rely on the Eller study. That is what we use to set our budget. We renew that study every 2 to 3 years, so it stays fairly current. And for our budget in fiscal 21, the budget that we presented to the RTA board in May, we basically deflated the amount that was in the Eller study for fiscal 21 by 15%. So that was
I
in
want
line.
to make sure that we have that handled correctly.
Well, sounds like someone may be muted. We could all please make sure we're muted during the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. At any rate, so in terms of the revenue for fiscal 21 that was in our approved budget, it was a 15% off of the Eller estimate, that the Eller baseline estimate that we had received the year prior, or $77.7 million. Some things that we've noted recently, the May, was 4.3% above. It's likely due to pent-up demand. But there were some industry areas that were really very heavily impacted and remained impacted even into the month of May. Restaurant and bars, amusements and lodging were really the big ones. When you think about restaurants and bars, we all know what's happened with them. They're about 60% of what they were collecting. Amusements, think movie theaters, parks, things like that, miniature golf, golf courses, those would be typically in the amusement category. And then lodging is certainly something that we're all very familiar with. And lodging was really, is probably the most affected of the industry areas, other than perhaps amusements. Amusements don't represent a large amount of our overall revenue, but lodging can be up to 3% during the high seasons. The other thing that's interesting is that our remote sales is, you may be familiar, beginning in October of last year, we began taking deposits that were in what are called remote sales or marketplace facilitated sales. Those are two different categories in the tax code, and they really represent the internet sales. And we had a very, very strong month in May, even though May was a rebound month when things were starting to open back up. It set a record also for the most amount of internet sales. Internet sales, or these remote sales and marketplace facilitated sales, now represent about 10% of our total retail sales, and I expect that will continue to grow. It is increasingly looking durable, even though we typically think of, like Black Monday, following Thanksgiving being the big internet sales day, and maybe Amazon Prime Day as being days that really resonate with consumers on the internet sales. We actually were $40,000 more in revenue in May, over and above our holiday peak the year prior. So this is something that is, again, looking durable. I mentioned to you our Eller baseline study, our Eller forecast that was released in 2019. This is what it looks like. The red line represents our baseline, and these are in nominal dollars. So what that means, it's the year collection dollars, and it factors into it inflation. So when you look at the pessimistic forecast, we actually collect more money in the pessimistic forecast, but that's due to the fact that we've got inflation built into the numbers here. The baseline number is what we have been using for our budgeting process, and you can see what it looks like going out. When we do it, we look out basically about 30 years into the future, so that we can cover any long-range planning as well as the short-term planning for the RTA. When I mentioned our budget for fiscal 21, this is what the board adopted for fiscal 21, the $77.28 million. You can see it relative to the budget, the actuals for fiscal 19 and fiscal 20. And kind of in closing, what I wanted to let you know is that we have not resolved on a set of numbers yet for what we're going to put into the 22 to 26 TIP. We've got some working ideas as to what we're proposing, or what we're likely to propose. We know that we're going to need to get more refinement. We're going to need to get more information from, for one, the Eller Business Research Center. We are looking at going out to them again towards the end of the year. We think doing it any sooner than that probably won't give us much more than we could get right now. We're still in a state of flux. We don't know how the economy is going to fully react. We'll probably be closer to the availability of perhaps some treatments or some vaccines by the time we do this. And so that's our recommendation. And this is what we told the board, is that we would be recommending to go back to Eller towards the end of the year, or perhaps even into early 2021, to update our revenue forecast for both the 2022 to 26 TIP and the RTA Next effort. We are, however, again, working with some revenue estimates. As many of you are probably aware, our team is always looking at trajectories on revenue and cash flow. We update it more than one time a month. In fact, James and Corey do a great job of working with us on that. And what we're thinking right now, kind of our working numbers are that we'll be looking at, in addition to the 15% that we've got in a cut from baseline for this year, we're looking at perhaps a 10% reduction from next year's baseline number, and then 5% reduction the year following, and 5% the year following that, returning to the baseline in fiscal 25 and for 26. So that's kind of our working approach right now, subject to change, and that is where we're at right now. I will tell you that with those numbers, we still show that we'd be able to fully fund all of the RTA ballot items, or all of the RTA projects, the roadway element projects, at their full ballot amount. So with that, Mr. Chair, that is my report, and I'd be happy to answer any questions folks may have.
Great. Thank you, Mr. DeGrood. So this is an information item, but we do have time for any questions. So if you have a question and wish to speak, please unmute and please say your name.
Anna?
Hi, Anna, please proceed.
Hi, Jim. Thank you for the report. So I have a couple of quick questions. So we're going to work on estimates for RTA to be able to put into our notice of funding availability for the 22-26 program. Are we still aiming for in August for that NOFA to come out, or September, or do we know?
At this point, one of the things that, again, we're going to be moving very conservatively with, we're going to be looking at funding the RTA roadway element projects first, and maintaining the existing projects that are underway, transit and so forth, things that we've already got commitments on. We are looking at a reduction in the current year, or the remainder of the current 2020 to 24 TIP. So, at this point in time, we're not looking at a call for new projects. We're not also looking at a notice of funding reductions either. We're going to be trying to work through this over the coming months, but we're not inviting new projects at this time.
For the entire 2022 to 26 5-year plan?
Not until we have, at this point in time, we are not, we would be putting it out for the federal 5339 and 5310 projects. I believe those are or 5307. James would be able to tell you more about that. That is forthcoming.
Right. And we will talk a little bit about that under item 4 as well, but I think Jim's summary was right on point on that from the TIP perspective.
Okay. And then, so then for the fiscal year 20, we had 3 point some million extra, or more than we had budgeted in the program. does that money roll over RTA? That's a RTA money roll over to fiscal year 21, or how is that money?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Ms. Olivares, every dollar that is in the fiscal 2020 tip that was not expended, was programmed in 2020, we are doing a simple rollover into 2021. There's a minor tip amendment that we will be bringing forward to the TPC later this month, but in terms of funding that was in the fiscal 20 tip, if it wasn't expended during fiscal 20, it would be rolled into fiscal 21, with the exception of a few projects that we've been told are actually complete with remaining funds, and those are very minor amounts.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. DeGroot. Ms. Olivares, are there any other questions for Mr. DeGroot?
Amy, this is Keith.
Hi, Mr. Brand, please proceed.
Yeah, so Jim, it's very surprising and very encouraging with some of those May numbers, but how much of that you think was dependent upon the first stimulus and people spending that money? Are we going to be, are some of these numbers or projections going forward going to depend on continued stimulus on the federal government's part?
Mr. Chair, Mr. Brand, I can give you my opinion, but I am not an economist. My personal belief is that clearly the enhanced amount of unemployment insurance, the stimulus checks that went to individuals, and the continuing stimulus that may or may not be agreed upon federally, absolutely have an impact on our current situation. They definitely have prevented us from having more dire consequences associated with the pandemic. What remains to happen is very unclear to us at this point, but I think you're spot on. I think that the activities that have gone on as a result of the CARES Act and others have definitely kept us from feeling the full brunt of the pandemic.
All right, thank you, Mr. Brand. Mr. DeGroot, are there any more questions? Great. Well, I'm hearing no more questions on item 3. So with that, thank you very much, Mr. DeGroot, for your presentation. We'll move on to item 4. Item 4 is an action item on regional transportation funding revenue projections and programming availability. Nathan Barrett will start the discussion and will be sharing his screen. Mr. Barrett.
Hello, good morning, everybody. So by the end of this item, we're going to discuss what numbers we're going to program into the TIP, not program, but to use in the TIP for the fiscal constraining of the TIP. But I'm going to walk you through how we get to those numbers. It's going to be a little crunchy, but bear with me. What you're seeing on your screen right now is a spreadsheet that basically translates the HERF distribution formula as set forth into state law and translates it into a spreadsheet. The cells in blue, these are inputs and variables that can be adjusted. We can discuss those if need be. Cells in gray are outputs. And then cells in white are just intermediate steps in which calculations are performed. So the first set of inputs are population numbers. There are 4 types of population numbers that go into the HERF distribution formula. Let's turn our eyes to them right now. I'm going to enlarge the screen. I'm going to focus on this table here. There are 5 municipalities in Pima County, and they account for 3 of the 4 population proportions that are used in HERF distributions. The first is the proportion of these 5 municipalities, their incorporated population, as a proportion of the total incorporated population of Pima County. So that's why they add up to 100%. The second set of population numbers that are used for HERF distribution is the incorporated population of these 5 municipalities as a proportion to the total incorporated population of the state. Finally, there's a distribution, it's called the 3% distribution, that goes to any city that has a population of over 300,000. Currently, that is 3 cities, Phoenix, Tucson, and Mesa. And so this population proportion is the proportion of Tucson's population to the total population of those 3 cities. It's roughly 20%. These numbers are taken from the most recent HERF distribution report, June 2020. And then finally, the fourth and final population proportion that's used in HERF distribution is the proportion of Pima County's unincorporated population to the unincorporated population of the entire state. So roughly 25% of the unincorporated population of Arizona lives in unincorporated Pima County. The second set of variables that are used for HERF distributions are gasoline and diesel sales. PAG keeps a spreadsheet in which we record gallons of gasoline, gallons of diesel sold every month. This spreadsheet is a fairly continuous record going back several decades, but we just use the 3 most recent years to come up with these proportions. Gasoline sales are used for calculations for the cities and towns. In the last 3 years, we have averaged 13.5% of the statewide sales occur in Pima County. Use fuel, this proportion is actually gasoline plus diesel, and it's 13.9% of total gasoline and diesel sales in the state occur in Pima County. This is used for calculations for county distributions. Which brings us then probably to the number that you're most interested in, is what is going to be the statewide total of HERF collections in the coming year. Let me explain how I came up with this particular projection. I first started with a hypothetical total for 2020. This hypothetical total took the first 9 months of the fiscal year and then continued the upward trend on those 9 months for the total of 12 months to come up with a hypothetical total. I then looked at the final 3 months of the fiscal year, April, May, and June, because this is where the decrease in HERF collections appears, and compared those to the same month, April, May, and June of 2019, to look at how much they decreased. On average, April, May, and June decreased by 20% in those months. So I took that hypothetical total I just mentioned, applied a 20% decrease to that, and came up with a number very similar to what you're seeing here. But then just to simplify the process, I said it's a 15% decrease from the actual fiscal year 2020 collections. And that's what we're seeing on the screen here. $1.2 billion in collections. The next box is DPS transfer. By state law, $10 million can be transferred out of the HERF to fund the DPS, the Department of Public Safety. In recent years, the legislature has oftentimes increased that. We have seen years when the DPS transfer was as high as $100 million. But in the last couple of years, the legislature passed a state highway safety fee, which is assessed by the Director of Transportation for the state. And this has decreased and eliminated the need for this DPS transfer out of the HERF. This was a fairly controversial law, and it is in the process of being repealed and sunsetted. But for now, we're not seeing any HERF diversions this year, not even the 10 million that are would otherwise be allowed by law. The ESP, this is an economic security fund, $1 million comes out of the HERF every year to fund that, and then motor vehicle divisions. Special distributions. In the past couple of years, we've seen these fancy budget maneuvers where the legislature would take $30 million off the top of the HERF distribution formula and redistribute it to cities, towns, counties using a completely separate formula. In some years, we've had 2 different types of special distribution. This year, in the 2020 legislative session, we have a question.
Oh, excuse me. Sounds like we have someone who's unmuted. If everyone can please mute your microphones, please. Thank you.
The 2020 legislative session adjourned early due to COVID. They adjourned mid-March. Before they did so, though, they passed what has been called a skinny budget, a budget that just does the bare minimum of funding the government, keeping it moving without doing fancy budget maneuvers. So there are no special distributions in the coming fiscal year. So that leaves about $1.2 billion allowable for distribution. Roughly half of that goes to the State Highway Fund. State Highway Fund mostly goes towards funding ADOT projects, but this is the fund from which our 12.6 and 2.6 funds come from. The other 49.5% gets distributed to cities with a population of over 300,000 and counties. And I can, if desired, go through what exactly the distribution formula is for cities and counties, but for now I'll skip that. I'll return to that if we get a specific question on that. But when you take these totals and run them through the HERF distribution formulas, these are the annual totals we're looking at for Marana, Oro Valley, Sarita, South Tucson. Tucson gets their regular distribution, add in their 3% distribution for the cities over 300,000 population, and this is what we're looking at. Within the next week or so, I'm going to take these numbers and run them through a model and come up with a month-by-month estimate on what these numbers are going to look like. But right now, we do not have those numbers, and those numbers don't really play into the TIP and how we program the TIP. Pima County HERF, this is how much we're expecting them to get based on the $1.2 billion in HERF collections. There is a proportion of VLT. VLT is a little complicated. Some VLT gets deposited into the HERF and basically becomes HERF and becomes indistinguishable in this state total. But there is a portion of VLT that gets distributed to counties for transportation purposes. And every year we attempt to estimate this. And every year it's notoriously difficult because it's not really based on gasoline sales, and trends can be wonky and move up and down, etc. So for the Pima County VLT, we're estimating the same 15% decrease that we're expecting in the HERF collections. And that brings us to the 12.6 and 2.6. This is named because it represents 12.6% or 2.6% of what gets distributed to the State Highway Fund here, but we have to share it with MAG, and MAG gets 75% of it, and we get 25% of it. So when we talk about 12.6% funds, it's 25% of 12.6% of 50.5% of the total HERF collections. There is interest earnings on that as they sit in our accounts. It doesn't really amount to much in any given year. And when it comes down to it, these are the numbers we're looking at for 12.6 and 2.6 revenues in the coming fiscal year. A little over $20 million and about $4.25 million of 2.6. I'm about to switch over to another spreadsheet, and we're going to talk about what actual programming numbers would look like in the TIP. But before I do so, I wanted to pause and see if there are any questions on the numbers in this HERF distribution formula. Okay, hearing nothing, as I said, I'm going to switch over. So the numbers that we use in the TIP for fiscal constraint of the TIP are rounded numbers based on recent actuals. And then we have to apply a rounded growth assumption over the next 5 years. So when we look at the actuals for HERF 12.6, it was $24.5 million. But as I had mentioned in the previous spreadsheet, it was already coming down during those last 3 months of the fiscal year. and then 5.25 in HERF 26 collections and 21.5 million in SDBG. So what does that mean for actual programming? Let's take a look at this chart. This first column here, this is the number that we're currently constraining to in the TIP. As you can see, because we don't have a 2025 or a 2026 in the TIP, because our current TIP is 20 to 24. We don't have a number, a constraint number for 25 and 26 yet. This is the recommended number. And then this is the change, the plus or minus over under how much we'd have to program in new funding or how much we'd have to take out in order to get to that fiscal constraint. So the recommended programming number is for 12.6 and 2.6 is 20 million and 4.25. If we go back to the previous spreadsheet, that's on track with what we had estimated in terms of revenues. A little over $20 million and a little over 4.25. In terms of growth on those, we're just throwing in a growth of $1 million a year. That's a reasonable expectation. Yesterday morning, I virtually sat with the RAP panel, the Risk Analysis Process panel. This is ADOT's. This is the beginning of ADOT's revenue estimate process. Every August, they gather a panel of economists and talk about the future. And a recurring theme in yesterday's meeting was, we don't know what's going on. The coming economic contraction is unlike anything we've ever seen before. And a lot of the numbers that were explored at that meeting yesterday, part of the process is a high number and a low number, an optimistic and a pessimistic number. And another recurring theme was the difference between that high and low number needs to be bigger, just because the uncertainty is so great. So we don't know how quickly we're going to recover on our 12.6. Past growth of HERF 12.6 has been about $1 million a year. So we're going with that. $20 million starting in 2021, and then just regrowing that fund by $1 million a year for the next 5 or 6 years. With HERF 26, it's a $250,000 growth. Again, that matches historical growth rates. We'll take a look. We'll keep an eye on that. Which then finally brings me to the STBG number, which, if you're still awake, you'll notice is much more optimistic than our HERF 12.6 and 2.6. In fact, we'd be adding STBG into the system, into the program. Why is that? Well, first off, we ended 2020 with $21.5 million. Why do we think it's going to stay steady and not reduce? Well, it's going to stay steady, first of all, because we are at the end of the FAST Act. We are about to enter a period where quite likely we're going to see continuing resolutions. I say quite likely because that's what we saw at the end of Safety Lou, that's what we saw at the end of MAP 21, and frankly, we're in an election year. Congress is not going to want to get out in front of this and risk, election or re-election. And so we're looking at continuing resolutions, probably for another year, possibly more. Safety Lou, I believe, saw 2 or 3 years of continuing resolutions. MAP 21 saw 1 or 2. I'd have to look up the exact numbers on those. And then even then, we are at historically high levels of the size of our slice of pie. Back in the days of Safety Lou, COGS and MPOs received 50% of the STBG that a state received. Starting with the FAST Act, they increased the size of our slice of pie by 1% a year. So the first year of the FAST Act, it was 51% of the state's STBG got distributed to COGS and MPOs. Until the end of the FAST Act, which we're just finishing up now, and we're receiving 55%. I don't think there's much room for growth on that pie. So that's why it's not increasing, and that's why it's staying steady. Why is it not decreasing? Again, we looked at his history. I looked at 2008, and historically, STBG funds have been somewhat recession-proof. The Highway Trust Fund basically gets front-loaded with its funds, and then are distributed, allocated each year of the appropriate legislation. Congress has the option to appropriate less than what is actually authorized, but we haven't seen it do that. It didn't do it during the recession to 2008 and 2009. So we don't expect the economic contraction to have an impact on STBG in that way. What may impact STBG, where we did see a decrease in STBG to the PAG region, was a result of the 2010 census. As population numbers were updated, formulas then got updated, and PAG saw a hit to our STBG sub-allocation because of the 2010 census. We may see that, but again, that is just such an unknown. I am not accounting for that. And so we're just looking at $21.5 million of STBG flat for the next 5 or 6 years through the end of this particular TIP. So these are the programming numbers by which we will constrain the TIP. And we are looking for discussion from our jurisdictional partners, and then hopefully a recommendation to move forward with these numbers. I can answer any questions you might have.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Barrett. We'll now take some time to address any questions you may have for him. If you have a question, please unmute and state your name.
Mr. Chair, this is Jose, Town of Oro Valley.
Hi, yeah, Jose, please proceed.
Mr. Barrett, first question, when does the state come up with their projections? The $1.2 billion you shown on the other slide, that's your projection. When does the state come up with their projection?
They lag behind us a couple months. We're not going to see their projection until December. So we have to get out in front of this if we're going to have our TIP ready to go by the end of the fiscal year. So this has historically been an issue.
So in December, they come up with their projection.
That is correct.
And in the past, how close were your projections versus their projections? Are they pretty close?
Yeah. I've never sat down to do a study to compare my historical record, so to speak. But every month I report to TPC on the HERF revenues, and I sometimes like to brag at how good my projections are coming in. So I like to think that I've got a fairly good feel for where this is going.
Thank you. Next question. I see a significant reduction in funds projections for the next couple of years. How is that impacting the projects that are identified in the TIP? I mean, are they moving back? I mean, we haven't seen those projects, or have you identified the projects that are going to be impacted?
As far as I know, we have not gone through that exercise yet because these numbers have not yet been approved. Once these numbers are approved, then we're going to have to go through an exercise of constraining the TIP.
Got it. So you first identify. Okay. Got it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. Mr. Barrett, are there other questions?
Hi, this is Anna.
Hi, Anna. Please proceed.
Thank you. So following up on Jose's question, where the state projection comes out in December, and if it's different than your current one, Nathan, so you've done a great job, spot on. But if it is different, how do we make adjustments to that? How do we adjust in the plan?
We haven't in the past because at that point in the TIP process, we are getting ready to model our project list for air quality in Title VI. So by the time we get the state's numbers, we've already put together a slate of projects. We've already fiscally constrained it. And then going back to revisit it would delay it such that we may not hit the modeling before the public process on the TIP later in the spring. So having said that we haven't done that in the past doesn't mean that we can't somehow come up with a way if the state's numbers come back much rosier than what my pessimistic outlook is showing. It may be beneficial to go back and add some funds back into the program, but we don't have an established process for doing that.
If I may, Mr. Barrett, yeah, thank you, Ms. Olivares. Would we issue a supplemental NOFA in the case that we were receiving excess funds? Our projections were too conservative. Is that an option? And then also, I guess, because we repeat this cycle every 2 years, we'll be revisiting this in a couple of years and we'll make adjustments.
Yeah, we're not locked into these numbers forever. In terms of the supplemental NOFA, it really depends on which funding sources are being would be adjusted by such an action. Because some of these funding sources are constrained by RTA board policy and which projects they can be thus used on. So we just have to cross that bridge when we get to it.
So, I mean, that would be a nice bridge, should that come, right? I mean, should that happen, then it is much rosier. Because we're gonna budget to a certain number. If we get a much rosier outcome, we could either move up projects that we delayed because of the pessimistic or fund them. So we'd have to, because we can't just store that funding somewhere, right? It has to be, or can it be stored the extra and rolls over to next year? Could that happen?
No, because the TIP is going to be constrained to these numbers. And so if we increase those numbers sometime during the TIP development process, then we'd want, well, again, it depends on the funding source.
Yeah, so I guess it depends, like Jamie said, depending on what it is, what funding, we might do a NOFA. I mean, we'd have to account for any extra that comes in. We'd have to find a way to see where it all went. Because once we approve these recommended numbers, we're constrained to those, and anything extra needs to be put somewhere, I'm assuming.
Yes. One of the reasons why we do have a reserve section in the TIP is kind of so we don't forget about projects that had to come out of the TIP or be delayed, so that we've got a ready list of projects, available when and if extra funding becomes available. We can look at that reserve project and reserve list and start from there. So there's always that option of just keeping the reserve list handy and using it as a tool.
Okay, I have another question, if you don't mind, Jamie, Nathan.
Yeah, thank you.
So as we were trying to find out, and maybe it's because we don't have the access to it, but when were these current amounts approved? Do you guys remember when they might have been approved? Because they're slightly different than what's in the packet, but so we couldn't find.
Last time they were approved would have been 2 years ago, at the start of the last TIP cycle. Last year we were, I took a look at them and may have adjusted slightly in my spreadsheet, but did not change them in the TIP itself. Just to kind of see where we were, whether we were hitting the projections. But yeah, the last time they were approved and put into the TIP as a constraining number was 2 years ago when we last did a TIP.
Because they're slightly different than what's in the 2020-2024 TIP. So unless we're looking at this is why I asked. So for fiscal year 21, what we had back then was for 12.6 was 24,150. And for 2.6, we had 5,150. And for STP, we had 19.
Okay, I'll have to take a look at the paper trail and see how and when those estimates were adjusted. Yeah.
So I mean, yeah, I'd rather know what the real one is, since that changes what the difference is that we have to adjust. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I'm going to go to the PAG tip right now on my other screen, so you're not seeing this, hopefully.
I think this is an important question. Thank you. Said I think recommendation will still hold, but yeah, I don't know if you're able to look at that quickly, Nathan, and maybe confirm that discrepancy?
Okay, so I think what we're seeing here, okay, so last year I went through an exercise, an internal exercise of adjusting the numbers in my spreadsheet. And I think we discussed internally, do we want to adjust the tip, constraining numbers mid-tip cycle? And we decided not to. And it looks like I did not change these back. So on it is right, that's 24,150. This is 5150, 55,150,123. And what I'm looking at here, does everyone see this page from the tip? So these are the numbers that are currently in the tip that are being used for constraint. So those did not change when I played around with the spreadsheet in that internal exercise last year. So 19, 1, 2, 3, 2. All right.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, thank you for noticing that.
I would love to take the credit, but you know it was Catherine who noticed that.
Thank you, Catherine.
Yeah, she's busy with her children today.
Right. Okay.
So Nathan, if I may jump in, so you just changed the spreadsheet. But what I think I heard was that this current actually didn't represent what was in the last tip, but you had made a mid-cycle adjustment. Is that correct?
I had made a mid-cycle adjustment to this spreadsheet. It was part of an internal exercise, a kind of what-if scenario, and then we decided not to go forward and push those numbers into the database. So it was kind of a war game exercise. It's just that I did not revert the numbers back to what was actually in the TIP database, what was actually constraining the numbers, constraining the database at the time. So these numbers that you're seeing here now match the numbers that are currently being used to constrain the TIP in the TIP database.
This is Diana. I have a question. So given that we're anticipating a reduction in the revenue dollars, what happens to projects that are in the TIP that can no longer be funded because of if we change this recommended, how will that be reflected in the TIP? Will those projects just be moved in the TIP to unfunded because we are changing the recommendation?
Generally, what happens in this situation, and again, I'm speaking in generalities, and I'm speaking based on exercises we've done with ADOT in the past. Generally, what happens, a project will get delayed, will get pushed back in the TIP rather than removed. So we have, as you can see, a lot of unprogrammed funds here in 25 and 26. So if we have to push back $4 million from 21 and $3 million from 22 and another $2 million from 23 and another 20 from 24, that totals up to $11,750,000. So we're going to have $11 million of projects that are going to be delayed in some way, and then will get absorbed somehow in 2025. Now, having said that, I'm not saying that a project currently programmed in 21 is going to get pushed back to 25. So it's going to be more of a domino effect. Some projects in 21 are going to get pushed back to 22, and then a greater number of projects from 22 will get pushed back to 23, and so on and so forth until they're absorbed by the unprogrammed funds in 25. That's generally what happens when funds need to be removed from a program.
Thank you. And that'll be worked through the committee?
Yes, that's going to be the exercise that we're going to be going through for the next couple months.
Okay, but it'll be going through with all the agencies and working through it in the committee, with the agency committee. I forget what that committee's called, but I know there's a working committee on this.
I don't know the process. This will, I believe, largely be RTA run because these HERF 12.6 are being used to deliver RTA priorities. There's going to be a lot of RTA cash flowing, a lot of cash flow exercises, etc. So I would defer to Jim DeGrood on the process that he foresees.
Thanks, Nathan. If I may jump in, Diana, everything that's in the current fiscal 21 TIP, our budget, and particularly with this TIP amendment that we're going to be doing at the September meeting, we're solid in terms of everything that's in the current plan, including what rolled from fiscal 20. We're funding. It meets our budgetary constraints. What we will have to do is on the 2022 to 2026 TIP development process, we will take that through the committee. We're working on a recommendation, and then we'll present that, and then that's something that we will be putting through the full-blown process. So that's something that is forthcoming. We've got in aggregate somewhere around $45 million just based upon our current thinking that we've lost over the current or the remainder of the 2020 to 2026 TIP in terms of revenue. So we're going to have to make some adjustments. It's forthcoming, and we'll do it collaboratively.
So,
excuse me, this is Dave. Jim, would you mind describing what that process is for Diana and the rest of us?
Well, at this point in time, we know that there will not be a notice of funding availability that will be coming out with the next TIP. We have to make up the shortfall. We don't yet know what that shortfall is, so it's going to be something of an iterative process. And I can't tell you that I know all of the details. I'm reviewing a plan forward with Mr. Mogimi right now, and we will we'll be bringing it out in the full daylight of this committee, or actually not this committee, but the TPC.
All right, this is Anna. So I just want to make sure I understood. So for the 2022 to 2026 plan, there will be no notice of funding availability at all.
I have to stand corrected on that. There will be a transit related one that's coming out.
Okay, a transit one, and then
yes.
So
I think I mentioned that in my report.
I'm sorry. So when we look at these like STPG that has $2.5 million extra every year, that will be added somewhere to an existing project? Is that what we're thinking?
We will be working to ensure that we're fully funding the plan that has been presented and approved by the voters, and that's going to be our once if there are funds remaining that we can then make available, once we've satisfied that plan, we'll certainly make those funds available.
Okay, so probably prior to our TPC meeting, we'll be able to see how that funding is being allocated, and then which projects are moving or which projects are going to be allocated. Or
I won't be able to. I'll be able to tell you at the TPC meeting what we're doing with the fiscal 21 TIP.
Okay, but we won't be ready yet for the 22 to 26.
That's correct. Things are still in flux.
Okay, thank you.
This was so is there going to be a follow-up TIP subcommittee? Because in the past, that's where these things would work out. We work out the details as to what projects are going to get moved, because obviously the funding are not there. So obviously there's going to be a follow-up TIP meeting, right?
I don't know that for fact. I know that we'll do it through the TPC at the very least. I don't know whether it needs to go through the TIP subcommittee or not. I know we would, if we're talking about differences in revenue, then I have no, I mean, that would be where we would certainly want to present revenue changes, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, but Jose brings up a good point, and I don't know if it's written in our rules and regulations that we have to do that. So can somebody please check if we have to go through the TIP subcommittee first?
And I'm going to also agree with Anna. I think it's very important that if we're going to be making changes or moving projects around because of the funding challenges, I would like to see it also go to the subcommittee. That's why I asked.
Well, I know in the past, we used to do that at the TIP subcommittee. The finance subcommittee will approve the projections, and then from there, it would go to the TIP subcommittee. And then sometimes we used to be there for 2 days to hash out these issues. We got to get the TIP constraint before it goes to the state. So now it's a lot different now because most of the projects are RTA projects. So,
And if I may jump in, this is Jamie. So what we've currently outlined, because of the intense constraint on funding and also the need to make sure we deliver on the RTA commitments. Of course, there's a lot of uncertainty around the funding. As Jim mentioned, the NOFA will be limited. The Notice of Funding Availability memo will be limited to those FTA transit grant programs at this time. And we had anticipated that we would still schedule meetings with our member agency partners, individual meetings in the fall like we usually do, to talk through the different projects, where they are, provide a status update, and see, have conversations about any changes that need to be made. So we're still working through that process, but I think it's important to note that this is going to be a very different TIP development process because of these different factors that Jim's mentioned, Nathan has mentioned, and I mentioned as well. So we didn't anticipate the need for an all-day TIP subcommittee meeting like we usually have had because of that limited availability of funding for new projects this round.
I'm sorry, Jamie, Diana again. I think if ever there really is a time and a need is now, especially as we're talking about RTA next, and there's some opportunities to move some of those projects from 22 to 26 into the next RTA, as the agencies, that are going to be actually getting the projects done, making sure that we're working among each other. I think it'd be really important to pull all of us together so that we're having that holistic conversations about what projects we would best recommend based on our work level, what's going on within our agencies and everything. I think it would be really important to have that meeting. If there ever, I think now is more important than ever.
Thank you, Ms. Alarcon. And Jim, I don't know if there's anything more you wanted to add to that, but I think we're aware of the need to have these conversations, important conversations about not only the TIP development process, the programming, but also RTA Next. RTA Next is not on this agenda, but we know that that's being discussed with the CAC and with the Technical Management Committee and other committees as well. Jim, is there any more you wanted to add to this?
No, I think you've summarized it very, very well.
Okay, thank you.
Jamie, I have one more question, I think.
Yes.
So as we're going through this, also, federal funding that may become available, like for the transit funding or any other stimulus that might come through. Will any of that funding that comes through the federal as a stimulus, as additional because of COVID, will that go through PAG and show on our TIP? So when we do the transit NOFA, if there was any transit funding that came to that, will that show up on as a funding source or not?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Ms. Olivares. And Nathan, Jim, please jump in. But yes, I believe that will show up in the TIP as a funding source. Okay. And if we do see additional funds come through after we issue this quote unquote NOFA later this month, as we typically do for the beginning of a TIP development cycle, we have in our policies and procedures the ability to issue a supplemental NOFA for additional funds.
And Jamie, if I can add to that, we've had some experience in the last couple of years with a new flavor of STBG. I call it a new flavor. It has all the same eligibilities of STBG, but it's coming to the region from the federal general fund and not from the highway trust fund. And because of that source, it comes with a little bit more flexibility on how quickly it needs to be programmed. So this new flavor of STBG that we've received, a couple $1 million here, a couple $1 million there, it gets added to our STBG total, but then we've got like 2 or 3 years to actually program and obligate those funds. So if there's another COVID relief act that has a substantial portion of infrastructure funding, it is likely to come from the general fund and have that greater flexibility of programming, and that we can take 2 or 3 years to program. If that's the case, I could foresee not going through a supplemental NOFA and just holding on to those funds until another TIP development cycle in which it can just be programmed as part of the regular programming process. Now, that I'm not saying that's what's going to happen. I'm just saying that is an option and a possibility.
Okay, thank you. And so my last comment, because I wasn't clear where we ended it. So I know we need to work through fiscal year 21 because of looking at this from the current to the recommended, the -4 million, -900,000, and the +2.5. And then we don't know what the RTA is yet for 21 and that number. But all that funding affects all the projects we currently have in 21. So I guess when are we going?
Yeah, I'm sorry. If I may, Ms. Olivers, we've adopted our budget for 21. We're going to stand with it. We have the financial capabilities, unless there's a real unexpected turn of events. We'll be able to honor all of the commitments in the current TIP for fiscal 21. We will make one adjustment on some funding that is expected to go to the TPC this month. But outside of that, we've got an adopted budget, and we will have constraint. And I don't see any concerns with the 21 TIP.
So the -4.1 million of 12.6, we don't need that in 2021?
No, I'm not stating that. But we don't believe that we will consume that much money on the projects that it's currently sitting on.
Okay, so we must have new projections.
We have some
Of what the projects will spend?
Yeah, we've been working with the jurisdictions on what we think they'll spend.
Okay, so that would be nice to see sometime.
Yeah.
This has been a really good discussion, everybody. Thank you. Do we have any other questions? I know we're over time. We do have a request for action, but any other questions?
Here, I got one last question. We're going to make the recommendation for this funding projection. Does the state need to, do they need to concur with our recommendation, or can they look at it and say, no, we don't like those numbers, so you go back and work those numbers again? Does somebody in the state have to concur with our recommendation?
The state does not need to concur, but they do need to agree that these are reasonable numbers to expect. So
Okay.
Reasonable expectation is the byword when it comes to fiscal constraint in the TIP.
So yeah, so they need to agree on these numbers as well.
There's no formal process by which they would agree. And I don't think I've ever been in a situation where ADOT has contacted me and said, dude, your numbers are way too optimistic, way too rosy, scale them back.
Okay.
So
just asking, because I know this goes into the STIP, right? The state TIP?
Yeah. Mark Hoffman is on the phone. If he wants to chime in, if he has the ability to chime in, I'm kind of curious about that as well. What happens if we do get in a situation where the state strongly disagrees with the numbers that we're using for constraint? Like I said, it's never happened in my experience. We've never had a formal process by which ADOT gives us a thumbs up and says, good numbers. but I don't know what would happen if our numbers were so terrible that ADOT would have to speak up.
Well, the reason why I was asking, because we're showing these numbers that, like for Anna just mentioned, it's $4.1 million short. So normally in the all day tip, what we used to do is, okay, projects got to come out. They got to move back or they got to come out. And now we don't know how that's going to impact the projects. I know Jim just mentioned that we're okay on 2021, but we don't know how that, because we were projecting $24 million and now we're saying, it's going to be $20 million. So how does that $1 million impact the projects?
By federal regulations relating to fiscal constraints says that if new assumptions are applied and there's less money than thought, there's no requirement to immediately amend the TIP to get it back into fiscal constraint, but we will not be able to amend the HERF 12.6 fund, any HERF 12.6 funds in the TIP until it does get back into fiscal constraint. So there's no immediate trigger on this, but if we do want to or do intend to move some HERF 12.6 around later down, later in the year, at that point we'll have to scale it back immediately to keep it in constraint. But for now we're okay.
All right, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. Mr. Barrett. Anybody from ADOT wishes to speak, you're welcome to, but I think you addressed the question, Nathan. Thank you. Go ahead and share my video again. So hearing no more questions, I just wanted to say that the programming recommendation is important for the TIP development process. It establishes the amounts used for the required fiscal constraint analysis, as we talked about, for the proposed program of projects over the 5-year period. 2 years ago, at the beginning of the last TIP development cycle, we conducted a similar meeting with the TIP subcommittee. At the August 19th TPC meeting, we will provide an overview of what will be included in the memo that will commence the development of the process for the fiscal year 2022 to 2026 PAG TIP, which is also known as the NOFA, but as I mentioned, it'll be very scaled back, as Mr. DeGroote did as well. Given commitments to delivering on the already programmed RTA projects, as well as significant revenue uncertainty, the funding available for new projects will likely need to be restricted to FTA grant programs, as we mentioned, that the Transit Working Group typically considers and recommends to TPC. So before we invite any motions on this is an action item. Are there any questions? So if I may, so just to clarify what happened on screen. So thank you, Ms. Olivares and Ms. Skinner, for catching that mid-year current change that Nathan had inserted for internal purposes. He had moved that back to what was currently adopted. Thank you, Nathan. But the recommendation didn't change. And that's what we're voting on today, or asking for a recommendation on. So there's a recommended motion on the screen. Do we have a motion?
Jamie, I move to approve the recommended numbers as shown on the screen. The adopted funding revenue projected for 2022-2026 PAG.
I second it.
Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. With the motion, we have a second from Ms. Abramovitz, I believe. Any discussion? Hearing no discussion, I will now call for a vote.
I'm sorry, Diane, I have just one. I just want to reiterate in the discussion that I think it's very important that the subcommittee meet to have discussions relevant to any funding shortfalls that would have movement of projects that the subcommittee be put together and actually be part of the discussion so that it's very transparent and we're having the holistic conversation as a regional transportation authority. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I believe the minutes can reflect that in the discussion. Is that correct, Sonia?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So any other discussion? Thank you. I will now call for a vote. All in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
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 Thank you. All opposed, please indicate by saying nay. Hearing none opposed, the ayes have it. The motion passes. Thank you very much. I think we've concluded item 4. We're now on to item 5. Item 5 is adjournment. So with this, we want to thank everyone for taking the time to join us today. I apologize for going long, but I think the discussion was hopefully very helpful and productive for everyone. Appreciate all your feedback. This concludes the TIP subcommittee meeting, and when we have a motion for adjournment and that passes, please note that the screen will end abruptly. So I hope you have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you again. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
I make a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn, a second?
Second.
There's a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you, everyone. The motion carries. We are adjourned. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Aye.
Bye.